Everyone. We have tonight with us James from Prolekult, and we're going Prolekult. See, I even verify sometimes how to spell things like a minute before I say them, and I still do that. The audience is used to this, but it's what happens. Anyways, we are going to be talking about Marxism and some of the other kind of political ideologies around it, but in general, Marxism, what it is, what it means to us, all that fun stuff. And I'm going to bring James live here and then do a little introduction. So, first thing you'll notice on screen here is no face. James does not like to come on these things with video. So, we've got the YouTube URL up there and a little GIF of their logo. And of course, me, being, Mr. Anonymous here, I'm more than happy to have people hide their faces. Move my camera a little so it's, actually on my face. There we go. All right, so James, how's it going?
I'm good. It's quite late here in England at the moment, so I'm maybe a little slower than usual. But thank you so much for having me on. No, it's great to be here.
So it is past midnight there now, right?
Yeah, 5 minutes past. Yeah.
Yeah. So we aren't going to do some 3 or 4 hour stream here tonight. This is definitely going to be a shaky camera. Wow, there we go. Gonna be an hour-long show. If we go longer, hey, it's a miracle. But I'm assuming James will be falling asleep by then, and we'll just start hearing some snoring on the stream, and at that point, I'll cut the audio.
Sometimes I get myself into a question and I'll get worked up, so I might be on.
We've had people say I've only got 45 minutes, and like 2 hours in, they're like, I really need to go, and I'm like, I told you to leave an hour ago.
It happens. It happens.
Right. So you run a YouTube channel, and of course a Twitter and all the other stuff related to this, where you run Prolekult Films, and it is a Marxist film company, basically. And you put out multiple features, multiple shorts, like one feature a year. Is that do I understand it right?
Yeah, so we do one feature a year, and then at least 4 shorts and 2 film poems, which are like more for us than for anyone else. But that's where we play around with imagery and like filmmaking techniques so we can get better at it, really. And yeah, we try to do a variety of topics, mostly with an anti-imperialist kind of bent, first and foremost. But then also like it's a Marxist channel, so we'll do things like the Marxist critique of political economy, what we think the kind of broad development of world politics is at the moment, that kind of stuff.
Makes sense. I watched. Whoa, we got some echo there. I watched some of the videos on the channel, to kind of get a feel for things. And I don't know if you've ever seen them, but kind of the style that I see there, it kept making me want to make sure that tomorrow I watch Koyo no Katsuki.
I'm not actually familiar with that.
It's just a series of films that are mostly audio and video of like landscapes and like the world going forward, from way back all the way into technology, and it's very much like a visual audio kind of experience. It's not a movie per se, And Philip Glass soundtrack. It's a trilogy of movies, but like when I watched your stuff, you have this like tone to it that it reminded me of that tone.
I think that's my favorite comparison we've ever got, because who we normally get compared to with in terms of like cinematography and stuff is Adam Curtis, and I always kind of get a bit sort of, oh.
I mean, I don't know how to say this, but that feels kind of insulting.
Yeah, it does.
Do the people who say that like you, or
Yeah, they say it's like Adam Curtis if he had a class analysis or a materialist understanding of reality, which is like, okay, so you're saying that
it's a backhanded compliment.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
But, no, I like that comparison. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think you would love watching them. It's a 3-part trilogy, and the word is a Native American word, and it's amazing stuff. But I'll send you a link to it. I think you would really enjoy it.
Yes, please. I'll give that a try.
But so let's talk Marxism. When I first talked to you, it was one of our fans, one of the viewers of the show, who reached out and kind of got us connected. And I asked if you would come on and give us kind of the basic rundown of what you feel, Marxism really is, and then lead that into why you do the films you do, and kind of that is the pathway here. So let's open up there, right?
Yeah, sure.
What is Marxism to you?
So, I mean, Marxism is a lot of things, and it's quite hard to define, because when we're talking about it, we're talking about like a lot of different intellectual tendencies and political movements throughout history. And I think it's kind of, for me, it's always, having studied it for nearly 10 years now, I think like the big thing for me is what the Hungarian Marxist Lukács called Marxism, which is its method. When you bring it down to any kind of orthodoxy, Marxism is a method and an approach to the world, which is a materialist political philosophy, using the distinction in European philosophy between materialist and idealist. So a materialist political philosophy in that sense is one that views the world is material and real, and that happens before our ideas, whereas an idealist one is that the world is constructed by our ideas. And Marxism is a materialist philosophy which understands that what actually constructs reality is how we produce the goods that we need to survive, how we organize that production, and that is why classes arise and how class struggle shapes history. So when we get down to it, it's that kind of methodology, it's that view of things, and then the fact that Marxism attempts to be a partisan science of the working class, the proletariat in Marx's view, as the only class that he and I would argue can end class society. So in brief, that's what I would say. It is a scientific approach to kind of socialism, a scientific approach to class struggle, and that's what it should be. What it ends up being a lot of the time is not that, and we can possibly talk about that later on, but that is what it should be. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, that's all kind of the ideology behind it, and it's funny, saying the ideology behind a materialist, but it is that's that. Now, I have the big question, quite obviously. Have you, in your studies, do you think you have ever actually identified an honestly Marxist society that has existed and thrived in the world?
So, I mean, it depends what we mean by that, right?
Yeah.
So there have been workers' states, certainly. And I would even go so far as to say that I would say the USSR was one, because I think it's intellectually dishonest to say it wasn't one. It's intellectually dishonest to view that these societies had huge problems, which they did, and then say that, oh, it's not ours. Oh, it's not.
Right.
Whereas in reality, what I think the approach we need is, yeah, that was socialism, that was Marxism applied, but it went wrong, and how? So, and that's the really difficult question to get around, that can take a long time. Problem. Yeah.
Well, so there's a little echo, and I'm gonna change the thing here, coming from your speakers. Okay. But I lowered some volume here, and maybe that'll help. So, I agree, and I was hoping that that's where we could go with that. That the USSR did indeed start off attempting to go that route. Now, I always get into an argument with friends of mine who are like purist Marxists, right? Because I'm not anti-Marxism. I just I have some issues with human nature. I always believe that and I wish I didn't. I wish I was better than this, but I do believe that. In a Marxist society like the one that the USSR was constructed as, which, there are flavors of Marxism, and there are different people's interpretations of it, but as that one was, a person like Stalin will pretty much always be born, and will rise, and will do what he did. Like, the human nature is that human being does exist, is capable of existing, and by the very nature of the size of a country like that, will exist. That's a human nature argument, not an argument against Marxism itself, but that's always been my issue with just absolute pure Marxism, in that, someone like him and the way that, society was orchestrated from the top at that point really was able to abuse the system.
So, I mean, I've got a few disagreements there, I think.
I want them, please.
So first of all, I think that the role that Stalin played in the USSR is like kind of a simplification that we've had fed through different historical accounts, which were useful both for the West and for certain political elements within the Soviet Union to allow that narrative to happen. Whereas in reality, if you look at things like the purges or the Gulag system, you have the majority of the trials which led to people going to the gulags. I think it's 80% were workers' trials overseen by the mass of people, and came from accusations of lower level party members accusing other lower level party members. So it's not, it's not that Stalin oversaw all of that, right? It's not
Right.
that Stalin commanded an absolute power there. It's more that there was a process of a certain like a certain kind of process within the party and a process within the society. Now, the other question that comes up from that as well is the kind of broad development of the USSR. Like, we're talking about a society that existed for 74 years and took a number of like different developments and turns and was materially very different things in very different geographical contexts and time periods throughout all of that. And some of it progressive, some of it more kind of problematic or difficult to deal with, and some decisions that were wrong and some decisions that were right. Now, the problem with it is economic, fundamentally. The problem that comes, the reason that the Soviet Union ended up falling, the reason that certain more kind of difficult developments happened within the Soviet Union is fundamentally economic, right?
Yeah.
So the Bolsheviks came to power promising 100% employment, which
hard thing to deliver.
Yeah, especially in the middle of, well, first of all, like they got attacked immediately by the RAF. The British set up the RAF to attack the Bolsheviks and gassed villages across northern Russia from 1918 onward. Then Germany, Britain, other European kind of colonial powers backed the Tsarist white armies, and you had the Russian Civil War, which lasted for a considerable period at the end of World War One. Then you have this kind of period in the 1920s and 30s where things become more bureaucratic, and that's because of that 100% employment promise. They started to soak people up into more bureaucratic positions within the Soviet Union because those were the jobs that they could create without having to create sort of more physical industry or whatever to do so. And that leads to kind of more layers of society and who kind of have economic interests are slightly distinct from the rest of the society, slightly distinct from the peasantry, slightly distinct from the industrial proletariat. And that leads to a number of economic contradictions. Che Guevara's economic critiques of the Soviet Union, I think, are really, really useful, where he says that the Soviets, which are the workers' councils, kind of disbanded themselves because of a number of like economic laws that they passed.
Yep.
And then also Fidel Castro's kind of approach to the Soviet Union, I think, is really useful as well, which is that he says that blaming Stalin for everything is a historical simplism.
Yep.
And actually, it's a really complicated process involving like masses of people who did have a mass workers' democracy, even under Stalin, right?
Yeah, they did.
So that makes it much more complicated to understand why these things happened. And I don't think it can be brought down to human nature. It comes down to the economic force of scarcity, in my opinion. So we can see before kind of any like form of history that we're kind of familiar with in the 19th or 20th century, long before that, human beings were organized around like very communal societies, very democratic societies. The Iroquois Federation in what is now the Americas was one of the world's first and most advanced democracies.
13
you see that in Europe as well before
tribes coming together, yeah.
And you see that in the kind of in Europe as well, even before just before the kind of the Dryad period, which is the second ice age, which got rid of a lot of Europe's kind of forest gardens. And it's that economic force of scarcity which creates class, ultimately, because you need to organize production in such a way that combats that scarcity, and that leads to the formation of class around the means of production. And I don't think the Soviet Union was in a place to eliminate scarcity. Like materially, I don't think it could have happened in that period of human history.
Well, do you think it
Um,
was a period thing? Well, can you turn down me a little on that side?
yeah, sorry about that.
Just a little. Yeah, but for me, one of the things that I look at when I look at, especially early on, is they fought the scarcity and kind of failed that wonderful early promise that you don't make that promise. I mean, whether you want to do it or not, that's a hard promise to live up to. Set yourself goals that are obtainable, right? But as they're fighting that fight, they're fighting it in I mean, I've lived there. It is a harsh environment to attempt to fight off any forms of scarcity. Uh, their style of government, I think, would have done much better with a tropical climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you can look at Cuba,
Yeah,
and it has,
and it would have been even better if it wasn't for our interference for so long.
Yeah, and it also I think would have been because the USSR, being the first socialist society, had to take on a certain militaristic role because of the amount of attack it came under. But
Yeah,
also
simply for
because
defense.
yeah, but also because it became the leadership of the world revolution, right? Like there was revolutions across Eastern Europe, revolutions in Germany in certain points, revolutions across whole swathes of Africa in the 60s, revolutions in Asia in the 50s, so on and so forth, that the USSR for a long period of time had to lead. That means you do have to be militaristic because people are asking for your help all the time.
Yeah.
And like there's a great story of the arms race, like the Cold War, where intercontinental missiles, the Soviets were developing the framework for, not to bomb anyone, but to get to space.
Yeah.
It was only when the US started using them, or had demonstrated the power of the nukes in Hiroshima, which was a completely militarily pointless maneuver.
Absolutely.
Like the Soviets started to develop nuclear warheads as well, because they had to, because that was then the context in which they existed. So all these things are there. And I think the other thing to say about like the portrayal of the USSR is that like the gulags were kind of not exceptional in that period of history. Like you had work camps for the unemployed in Britain in the 1930s. You had like huge concentration camps set up by the British and the Americans in these periods, and the Germans, obviously, from the Nazis. So camps and things like that were kind of just a feature of those societies in that time period. That's not to defend them or like
No.
praise camps, but it's to sort of put that in historical context, because otherwise it kind of comes across as exceptional.
Which for the time it was not.
Yeah. So I can see the human nature argument kind of, I can see the logic of it, but I think it's a fundamentally economic question as to why human beings act in certain ways. If you don't have a material incentive to hoard wealth, which is born out of scarcity, then you won't.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't if I wanted to. I suck at capitalism, so like I'm poor as hell. I'm really good at like activism, but not capitalism. So I somewhat live a bit socialist, not by any choice, simply because it's just I'm really bad at money. Yeah, so with Marxism, you throw around a lot of words that for maybe our audience and a few more politically informed people just make sense. They know proletariat, they know bourgeoisie, they know these terms and kind of who you're speaking of. Which one is the class controlling things and which one is the oppressed. Like they understand all this stuff, right? But this is gonna go up on YouTube just like all of your stuff. Can you tell me, like, with Marxism, like, specifically, others have kind of different ideas on where these lines are, but with this one, proletariat really means, like, just the everyday everybody. It's not, your political leadership.
So proletariat means like, so yes, it does mean everyone in this period of history. It is a historically unique class of people, which is important to say. So Under feudalism, you still owned the land that you got in payment, like you were given an allotment to work in exchange for working the manor's kind of land. And that was like private property. That was technically, although it was rented, it was still your private property. You still had a way of producing your subsistence. Similarly, slaves, although completely dispossessed and in intolerable conditions, they were owned, and so they were the possession. That was upkept. That the person who owned them would buy their food, for example, and that's the unique relation in and of itself as well. Whereas the proletariat refers to the kind of industrial workforce that emerged following the Industrial Revolution in Britain, particularly, which doesn't own any forms of production and isn't owned. So instead of being owned, you then go and sell your ability to work for a number of hours to someone who owns the means of production. And that's historically unique because your direct material interests aren't the expansion of your small holding in the same way that a peasant would have, and aren't just your freedom from slavery to be a free person in whatever economic system that is, which was capitalism. So what the economic interests of the proletariat are is the end of private property, because they own nothing. So the only thing they can do as a collective force is take everything into common ownership. And that's the historically unique feature of the proletariat that Marx identified, as well as, unlike a number of other social systems, they are directly part of capital, part of investment, right? You can't have capital accumulation without workers at all. Whereas you can have feudal land owning without peasants being on that land owning.
Right.
So it's unique in the sense that it has a lot more power as well, or did until the 1980s, but that's probably getting a bit too into things.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are definitely time periods that changed a lot, but in general, that's the proletariat. Now, the bourgeoisie, explain these for us.
So the bourgeoisie are, so first of all, these are French words because they arise from the classical French Revolution.
Which had a similar problem of the people killing more of themselves than the bad leaders, even during their revolution.
Well, I mean, the French Revolution, the proletariat were kind of used by the bourgeoisie and betrayed.
And a hell of a lot more of them died than the rich. And we see this thing, there's this like fantasy of all these guillotines and the rich getting their heads chopped off. And for every one of those that happened, thousands of, the revolutionaries fought other revolutionaries and killed them.
Yeah.
It was
because, and that was because like the French Revolution was a bourgeois revolution, a capitalist revolution at the end of the day. The bourgeoisie are the capitalist class, the people who own the means of production, by which we mean factories, your workplaces, now internet systems, banks, those kind of things. They don't work, they hire people to work, and that's how they make their profits.
And they hoard by wage theft and every other method they possibly can.
Yes.
Okay, so it's simple enough. I mean, that's a very, that's a view of the world. Now, what's so different in a Marxist society compared to, like, our republic or your, parliamentarian democracy that you have? What is the real difference that a Marxist would want out of that society?
So we have a nominal democracy in the sense that we can vote for representatives in both the Republican system and in the parliamentarian system, right?
Yep.
That doesn't change the fundamental economic relations of our society, as I'm sure many of your viewers know.
Yes.
Like, nothing really changes for the ordinary person, except for perhaps the moderation of taxes, or perhaps occasionally a slight rise in wages, if you've been alive enough to see one, which a lot of people haven't these days.
Right.
So, that's kind of what you can get out of that. What a Marxist system of democracy would be is a direct and participative form of democracy. Now that can take, and specifically a direct and participatory democracy, which rules over the way we produce goods and work. And so you can see that in a number of ways. So the Soviet Union refers to workers' councils who ruled over the factory or so on and so forth. In Cuba today, we have an example of a mass participative democracy where millions of the people in their society are able to give feedback and edit laws that are proposed, and then those changes are adopted, and then it goes to a mass vote after those processes of consultation. You also have committees for the defense of the revolution in Cuba, which is the basic organizing point of their democracy, which is like a neighborhood, and they get to make all the democratic decisions about their neighborhood, as well as electing representatives from their community. But those representatives are recallable and directly responsible to those people. And so you have a much more direct relation where people actually have to say why they're doing certain things, otherwise there are consequences. Similarly, like people can rule over production in Cuba through the participation of trade unions, which still do exist in Cuba. They're part of the state, and they can change the way workplaces operate and so on and so forth. So that would be a participant democracy, one where people are actually involved in shaping law, in shaping the democracy of their society in a very direct.
And there's actual repercussions for the people they've elected into office to be recalled very quickly if they aren't doing what they're told.
Well, there's that element to it, but then also the ability to shape law as well. And I think that's the more important part, perhaps.
Yeah.
That, ordinary people.
I focus on that one because there's a lot of people who got voted in and then didn't do anything they said they were going to do, and that that's problematic to me in our style of government.
Well, in our style of government, that's kind of the only thing you're elected to do is what you say.
Right, and most of them don't.
No. I mean, it comes to something I think that European kind of social democratic parties like the Labour Party in Britain. We had Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party here for quite a while, and he ran on an anti-cuts position. And then in the first year of him being leader of the Labour Party, instructed all of the Labour councils in Britain to make those cuts.
Of course. I get it. Sure. So, the one argument that I had there was, just this human nature problem with this at scale. Like, I've seen communal style living. I've seen various mutual aid style networks that also, have a Marxist twist to them function at certain sizes. But I mean, the USSR specifically, to me, had most of its major problems come from the outside, in that various economic sanctions, them being forced into a war machine with us that just was a never-ending suck on all of their actual, resources that could have been used for the workers by the workers. So I don't say that they just completely failed on their own. There was definitely a problem there, but one of the things that I always found interesting with, the few versions of those societies that we've had is like, a few days ago I was watching, there's a YouTuber that I like because I'm into cars, I'm in sports and all the other fun stuff, standard guy from Texas, right? But there's a car YouTuber who reviews weird and odd cars, and he was reviewing a car from 1988 in the Soviet Union, one of the 4 cars that was available at that point. Because, again, the kind of state-run, state-owned setup there, right? And the car was, it had a pretty paint job, but inside the technology was everything we saw on 1960s U.S. cars in the 1988 USSR car that hadn't seen an update other than new model year that, had better gas mileage slightly every year for the last 30. It was a Lada, and I thought it was kind of cool looking, but that was more like nostalgia than anything else. But like, when I look at the various socialist societies of the past, not the say the Norwegian or the kind of Scandinavian style, democratic socialism, but that specific style, that's the feel of them. Very dated stuff, very very out of tune with the rest of the world in terms of advancement. Is that real, or is that just a perception that we have of this?
So I mean, like, there's different things going on there though. So on the one hand, like, there's that kind of conspicuous consumption around the style of your car, or even certain types of fashion or whatever, that the West tends to have more of, right? Like, or the capitalist societies tend to have more of. But then there's the fact that, like, even the CIA admit that Soviet citizens were better fed than American citizens on average. We see after the collapse of the Soviet Union, like, that massive glitzy lifestyle very much rises in Russia, for example.
Very quickly.
But so does poverty, and you have these huge regions for example, even in the rural areas between Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
There's, like, I think there's 18 villages that have one doctor who isn't even paid. He's just a volunteer from the Soviet era.
There were multiple of those villages that did not have doctors when I was living there. I was there in 96 and 97. And it was a very strange time to be in Russia, let me tell you. Especially as an American. You were watching them try and still come to terms with it, but then you were seeing there was a club scene with club kids driving around in Mercedes whose parents were getting rich off of, the capitalist deals they were making with American companies and whatnot. And at the same time, there were still bread lines.
Yeah, I think that the difference between a capitalist bread line and a socialist bread line is that there's always bread at the end of the socialist bread line.
Okay.
You might have to
That's
queue,
one of my favorite things
there.
I've ever heard said about socialism. Wow.
You can see in the US now that, you've got these huge bread lines stretching in response to the economic crisis. And that's from donations,
Yeah.
That's not from the state.
No, you've said my new favorite thing about socialism now. I love it. The chat has been talking a little here, and when I talked about the cars, like, specifically, but in general that's more like a manufacturing modernization kind of a thing. They were talking about trade sanctions and embargoes from the capitalist nations causing that to be the case.
And that certainly is in Cuba, but I think that's a good example in some cases. It's not always the case. I think sometimes it's just the fact that that kind of luxury commodity isn't valued as highly as the production of, like, necessities. Is the important angle I would go on, that, like, we have manufactured scarcity under capitalism, which, like, starves people, like, to death sometimes.
Yes.
Whereas and under socialism you don't have that unless there's a general shortage.
Right, unless there's some kind of a famine or something.
Yeah.
Something in the way. Well, Cuba's an interesting example of this, because this turned into a seriously cool car culture there, where they have so many old cars that they just keep kind of recycling the parts and repairing again and again and again, that you've still got people that have their main job in their life is rebuilding and repairing 1950s US cars.
Yeah, no, I actually went to Cuba, and I got to see some of the old cars and stuff like that, and, like, it's a cool little subculture, because, like, they have, like, races with these things, and they get, like, really beefed up versions of 1950s cars that no one would have ever made unless the embargo was there, because, like, it would be absurd to do so.
Right.
And yet the fact that these things from the 1950s still work with little bits of pipes that they found lying around and stuff is incredible, really, when you think about it. Like,
it really is. I mean, the reuse culture there and the recycling culture there is quite strong. But you've homed in on a piece of this for me a couple times, which has got me kind of thinking here, and that's the idea that material is definitely a word, but materialism, like crass consumerism in kind of American style, society, does lead to the ever growing need, as your items age, to replace them with the latest and greatest. And in societies that don't have those things, such as, say, what Cuba did for a long time, you end up with what Budo, one of the users in the chat, says is kind of this ingenuity around the reuse of what you have and spending your time making things last longer. And that's honestly better for the planet and better for the people. It's an
Yeah, and I
interesting
think that's
angle to this.
I think that's one of the big things, right? So like capitalist accumulation creates things for profit. Socialist state economies, which is not full communism, which is a different stage of development.
Right.
But socialist state economies can still moderate how much is produced and produce at a slower rate than it takes nature to replenish itself, right? Because
Right.
like it's not just like we do, like there's this kind of phrase that's used a lot that we have finite resources on a finite planet and we want infinite growth on it. And it's not just that, because like natural resources do replenish themselves if you like slow down how much you're taking. It's more that we can't consume at this rate and we can't have this kind of luxury economy. We can still have a developed technological society as long as we recycle that technology and make the best of it, and crucially orientate the way we produce it so it's naturally restorative. And that's what socialism can really bring, because it's a rationally based planning economy. If you have everything centralized under the state, you can plan things. Whereas if you have private interest guiding things, the margin always dictates what gets produced.
It is an interesting outlook. Now, of course, the powers that be these days are entrenched. They are powerful, they are strong, they are weaponized. They aren't going anywhere. Revolution, even like French style or Bolshevik style, or really any of the older style revolutions, I don't honestly see as possible. The militarized police will at some point start to just gun us the fuck down. So how do we get to some of these better places that you described, that these types of ideologies and these types of political thoughts bring about, with that in our way? I don't think revolution is always the answer to get us there either. I'm just saying, like, we're not doing that, so what else?
So I mean, like, organizing is a really complicated question when it comes down to like practical stuff, I think. Because like when we're talking about systemic change, like even if someone says, I believe a revolution is possible, then how and why and will it happen become huge problems, right?
Yeah.
What I think the more prescient thing to say is that this form of society is breaking down and that something will have to replace it, right? So we can see that in the ecological crises that confront our species. We can see that in the political crises and the economic crises that confront our species as well. So since COVID hit, we've seen massive wealth redispersal upward. So 35
Faster
the
than
richest
ever before.
Yeah, which Marx described in Capital as what would happen when capital reached this point, right? So
like a tipping point, yeah.
Yeah, it breaks down, but it breaks down by making them so wealthy that they own everything, and then the system can't function anymore because there's no jobs, there's no way of spending, there's no way of keeping that money in motion. And what's more important to them than the raw profits is that everything keeps ticking over, because the amount of money they receive doesn't really mean that much to them at that scale. It's just it's a form of power that they have that, and the processes that keep that accumulating are still going. That's what they want to do, rather than to like make, like, every individual capitalist wants to make ever more money,
Right.
but as a system, like, it just needs to keep things ticking over. And when profitable investments dry up, it can't do that. and they dry up when all the wealth is in their hands because there's no more to have.
So you end
So
up in oligarchy. You end up
you end up,
in basic state of the rich in actual control at that point, instead of just, off to the side but in control. Where through lobbyists and ownership and everything else, they are in control at this point. But you end up with an outright oligarchy, I would think. And at that point, I don't think you end up heading towards socialism. I think, much like Jeremy in chat says, you end up heading towards fascism. And I see that much more prevalent as an ideology that is growing and growing fast among especially, people here in America.
I mean, fascism is one potential outcome of that. But the thing is that what happens is when you reach this level of wealth accumulation, what it produces is a form of oligarchy, but with wealth hoarding happening there. And when that hoarding happens, it involves people withdrawing their investments from certain things that people need to survive. And so that means that, healthcare breaks down, food production breaks down. We can already see, and there was a story out today actually, food prices in Indonesia for tofu have gone up like 40% in the last week or so.
That's crazy.
And so, you have these huge things that force people into more and more desperation. And at that point, it becomes ever more people get thrown alongside, like the poorest people in society. People are increasingly impoverished. And that's when like revolutionary ruptures happen, because society's broken down. It's not fulfilling its social contract anymore. It's not fulfilling people's basic needs anymore. And so the question isn't to me whether or not people will resist en masse. They definitely will as this continues to break down. The question is giving them like political positions and ways of organizing, crucially like ways of organizing to take over production, which allows them to then try and build something new. So like if everyone's starving, the police might well start shooting at people, for example, as you gave in that kind of example earlier.
Worst case scenario, but they're already kind of shooting people, but that's more out of racism than anything else right now, I would think.
Yeah. But when it gets to such a scale that they're shooting the white workers, for example, in the US, because white workers are starving and having to take over factories and things, when it gets to such a scale that people are forced into that kind of mass, will they continue to do that, or will it just become untenable to do that any longer? It's,
right.
Like fascism is definitely a phenomenal possibility in our age. Like it could happen, and that's terrifying. But the economic basis of that's still significant, right? So historically, fascism happened because small capitalists allied with big capitalists in Germany and sections of the workers' movement. In Italy, it involved small capitalists, the clergy, and the peasantry, right?
Didn't people just want the trains to run on time?
Well, to a degree. But that's the thing, it promises stability. And if economically it can't provide that stability, then it won't work.
Right.
And the problem is that at this point, I don't think it can provide that stability, because the ecological crisis exists, and fascism's just going to make that worse. So it wouldn't last in any meaningful way, because it physically can't at this point, because it won't be able to fulfill people's needs, because we need a fundamentally different way of organizing production if we're going to survive as a species.
Well, so in Cuba, you have a society where, for lack of a better term to describe it, in that this term also has different meanings, it's very much mutual aid in the way that the neighborhoods work together to support their neighborhoods, the greater areas and so on, and it kind of grows up. We have our cities, our counties, our states, and so on here in America, but like the way they do it, like it's not just your family unit that you're trying to support. The Cubans that I know, I've got some close Cuban friends from my time when I lived in Florida that are still, close to their family in Cuba, and we've talked about the amount of support just a neighborhood gives to everyone in that neighborhood when someone struggles. And we don't have a lot of that here in America. And to, the greater extent, a lot of other more capitalist, Western style societies. And that would be a big change to just, the base mentality of a lot of people in these societies away from this me culture, this rugged individualism, this into something more helpful to the people around them, getting their fulfillment not out of the collection of goods, but instead out of the support and help they're giving to everyone around them. That would be glorious. I'm a bit pessimistic when it comes to convincing enough people that that's the correct path and actually having them go down it. Do you find yourself optimistic on this one?
No. This is where
straight answer.
I think people will resist. I don't think we're fated to win. Like that, to be clear. Like I don't think that at all.
Uphill battle. My favorite kind.
I think we're at a point now where it actually kind of looks increasingly like, not to be pessimistic, like we've already lost on a number of things. Like, the environmental crisis is deeply, deeply terrifying and picking up pace enormously. But without giving that into that, I think you're right. The biggest barrier that we have is culture, right? It's the way that our culture is organized and the ideas that it sows. This is something that was wrestled with in particularly Europe, where capitalism was really well developed following the Bolshevik Revolution. So following the Bolshevik Revolution, you had a series of revolutions taking place across Eastern and Western Europe, getting as far as Germany, but not much further than Germany. And the reason is quite difficult to explain, but the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci did his best to try. And what he said was that, you have the state, the raw power of the state. And that's scary, but it's not the big thing that holds this up. It's like an outer ditch. Beyond that, you have the castle of ideology and the way that's dominated. And that arises where things have been around longer, where this kind of consumptive attitude has been around much longer, in, for example, the United States and in Europe again. Right. So, yeah, we definitely have that problem. What I would say is perhaps a counterpoint is that I don't think that revolutionary change will start in Europe or America this time. And I think you can see that the starts of potentially revolutionary change in like Haiti at the moment, for example, where you've got loads of people rising up against corrupt regime, like as we speak. Yeah. And you can see that in across like the oppressed world, is what I would call it, of Asia, Africa, Latin America. And I think that's where change is fundamentally going to start. And I think that our duty in kind of in Britain for myself, or the United States for yourself, is to support those movements as much as we can, and to draw from their example until there is a bigger kind of movement here, if that makes sense.
It does. There is an African nation, similar to some of the other fun things I might have been involved in about a decade ago. A little spring that happened that is about to go that way relatively soon. And I've been heavily supporting where it's heading. And in hopes that it's a better place than it is today. And I think, that's the type of stuff that people really need to get involved in. Because you'd be surprised at what the support of just someone, you do not have to have money or power or anything to be able to support people that are in those types of situations. It's quite an amazingly simple thing to do. Sometimes they just need to know that people in the outside world want them to win this one. That in itself is a big lift to the mentality of someone fighting that kind of struggle.
Yeah, and I think the historically as well, when these kind of movements happen, they have big ruptures happen in the imperialist nations as well. So you see, for example, in the period where the Algerian War was happening against French colonialism in the 60s, you saw massive uprisings in France in solidarity with that uprising.
Right.
Similarly, you saw, in fact, arguably Portuguese colonialism and Portuguese fascism was toppled by African movements rather than anything in Portugal, because you had the movement in Guinea-Bissau, which overthrew Portuguese rule, which then led to a mass movement of black people in Portugal itself, which led to the overthrow of Portuguese fascism. So,
Yeah.
you know, like these
Domino
things are
effects.
really powerful.
Yeah. So, chat. You're pretty active right now. I cannot pronounce that last name there. Just all caps my name. But hi. Magicadelicis. And thanks for the sub and the follow there. Whoever gifted that one. Love you guys. Everyone here knows that that's how I eat my food. So if you guys would like to see me, continue to have dinner every now and then on stream, that helps. So thank you. I would like to say, chat, ask some questions. What do you got for us? The first one up is Marxism inherently opposed to nationalism?
Depends on the context of that nationalism. So, this is a difficult debate.
Yeah,
but
it is.
In a context where, say you're being oppressed by a colonizer, or you're being like the IMF or destroying your country, in that context, nationalism can play a revolutionary role because it's getting rid of an oppressor that isn't in your own nation. So it puts you on a more equal footing with people who are oppressing you within your own nation, is how we would view it. You can have a revolution against a colonial or a neo-colonial power that's dominating you, and that will necessarily be nationalistic. The Cuban Revolution, for example, began as a nationalist revolution. That's what it was. The slogan was Patria o Muerte, which means homeland or death. And that then matured into a socialist revolution. So, these things can play a progressive role. It's contextual. I don't personally, there are some people who would disagree with me, but I personally don't think that it can play a progressive role in a country like Britain, for example, or the United States.
It takes on a completely different meaning in those places.
Well, in the United States is a pretty clear example as well, because the United States is constructed on the graves of other nations.
Yeah. Exactly. We still celebrate Christopher Columbus Day. I
know. What a band.
What a world. Yeah. So we're up at the hour mark here, and I want to say, did you have anything that you hoped that we would say that we haven't yet, that you want to get out to the audience?
So there's a couple of points I kind of wanted to make around. Yeah. Sorry, I'm flagging a little bit now.
Yeah, I saw the hour mark and I was like, let's start winding down.
So the key things I wanted to get across are the big point of disagreement, I think, is on the left, is about a state, right? And I think that's a difficult debate to go into too much. But unless we have some kind of the central Marxist argument that I want to get across to people who aren't convinced of it, unless we have some kind of centralized planning, we are not going to be able to stop production from falling apart, and therefore huge amounts of people dying from want, or be able to guide production and develop it according to ecological requirements, because we need a global society if we're going to be able to do that. And it's only by having a state and then having states working in coordination that you can have a global society at first. But what I would add on to that is, and this is perhaps where I guess the anarchist would probably like what I'm about to say more, is that Marxism, communism, or socialism has a long-term tendency to decentralize production because it places productive power increasingly in the hands of masses of people, and therefore it localizes it again. Whereas in contrast, we've seen capitalism has a tendency to monopolize power and draw it into a central point. So what I would say is basically the long-term development of a socialist society is toward decentralizing power rather than centralizing it, although as contradictory as that sounds. And that's because of how we would try to develop production.
So the idea would be that the only real centralized nature of it is getting the planning in place so that the resources can actually be dealt with properly, because in the end you're not feeding a large society with no grain elevator in old times, and it kind of grows from there, right?
Yeah, so you
Like
want to
need pieces of the puzzle to feed masses of people.
yeah, and you need to, we live in a really unevenly developed world economy where, like, food production, most nations are not food sovereign. They can't feed themselves. Most nations do not produce energy for themselves. So you can't just begin at that point. You need to start to try and develop more and more economic sovereignty for democratic masses of people, basically.
So
And that takes
develop
time.
sustainability on your own without outside need over time.
Yeah, yeah, because we want a global democratic society, but one where we're not dependent on each other, because you can't have real freedom if you're dependent.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, thank you for my favorite new socialist saying. There is indeed always food at the end of the socialist breadline. That was good. What do you got, chat? You got any more questions here before we let this man go off and go to sleep? It's past 1 o'clock there now.
Just hit it, yeah.
I think chat might actually be being nice here and letting you go to sleep. They usually are. My chat is quite a cool bunch of people. I'm really, really happy with the audience we've cultivated here. These people are wonderful. Any suggested reading?
Any suggested reading? Yes.
Besides, like, Das Kapital.
I was lucky enough to work on a book called Socialism or Extinction, Climate, Automation and War in the Final Capitalist Breakdown. It's by an author called Ted Rees, who's also English. And we've just got the physical copy out
Nice.
as of today. So yeah, I'd recommend that. And the other one I would recommend for anyone who wants to learn more about Marxist economics particularly is a book by a long-forgotten Polish Marxist called Henryk Grossman, who I think rescued Marxism, called The Law of Accumulation, which is available for free on Marxist.org, so just search for Henryk Grossman on there.
Can you make sure to send me links to yours and to that one that are like the best links to both? And I'll put them in the YouTube description when this goes up tomorrow.
Yeah, that's bro.
Yeah, send them to me over Discord, and they'll go right in, and of course I'll link to your Twitter, your YouTube, all the fun stuff. This was great. Chat really loved this. Everyone join us on Discord. Everyone, can rewatch this on YouTube later. Looks like we are done for the night. This was fun. I'm really glad you came on. I think this is kind of broadened my understanding of it in ways that I'm there. I'm a member of the Democratic Socialist here in America. I'm definitely on board for a lot of the tenets of socialism, but there's so much to weed through because every single person I talk to has their interpretation of it, and man, do they differ. So just getting some of those fundamentals in place is really helpful,
I think just to kind of maybe conclude then, because like this is one of the big problems that we have in the internet age for Marxism, actually, is that we don't often have, like, Marxism's meant to be a social science, which means that it has to have standards. Like, and what we tend to have a lot at the moment is mudslinging matches on twitter.com, or
right.
Which doesn't help anyone and only draws out that kind of difference that you're talking about, that kind of fragmentation of the movement into little cells. Whereas if we had a more long form culture where people actually had to debate with facts or, face to face in political meetings, then that would be a lot less of a problem. And I think we'd actually make a lot more headway. Just to kind of leave it off on one point there. Thank you really very much for having me on as well. And I'm really glad I was able to broaden that kind of understanding.
Great. Well, everyone, chat, James, this has been great. We're gonna end the show there. Watch this again on YouTube. Subscribe, like, follow, all the fun things you can do to help us out here and keep the show going. Join us on Discord, which has been shown in the chat there, the link and all that fun stuff. Otherwise, good night, everybody.